A day after Sri Lankan President Anura Dissanayake completed his three-day visit to India, where he gave New Delhi key security assurances as well as investment opportunities and more, Dissanayake met with Qin Boyong, vice-chairperson of the political advisory body of the Chinese Communist Party, who was visiting Sri Lanka. Discussions, in fact, between both the leaders, a development of a partnership, investments and possible resumption of maritime research. In the meeting, Dissanayake expressed gratitude to the Chinese government for its support during debt restructuring as well as in the face of economic crisis, while emphasizing the continued need for Chinese support in the future. With this meeting, Dissanayake signals Sri Lanka's balancing act between India and China, with the government noting, in fact, that they want a win-win situation with all the countries. What does this mean for India? Let's try and decode this. So the big questions, ladies and gentlemen, that we are discussing on this important topic, in fact, at this moment is which way will the Sri Lankan government and the new president, which way is he tilting, which way will the country tilt? Win-win ties, what does this mean for India? Can there be a balancing act as far as both India and China are concerned? And how will India protect its maritime security in face of Sri Lanka, in fact, trying to balance the interest of both India and China? Joining me at this moment, Rohan Samarajiva, Sri Lankan Policy Analyst, chairman of in fact, the think tank there. Brahma Chellaney, strategic affairs expert, is also with us. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Chellaney, the meeting with the Chinese, a similar kind of statement, telling the Chinese that their interests will also be taken care of. How should India view this?
I think what's significant is that AKD paid his first overseas visit to India, not to China. But if you look at another Marxist prime minister in India's neighborhood, in Nepal, KP Oli, after taking office, he first visited Beijing. This was a breach of the long-standing custom in Nepal for a Nepalese prime minister to first visit India. So AKD did well by coming to New Delhi first, and he hasn't been to China so far. He did meet with this senior party official from China. He did give the right kind of assurances in New Delhi, but we know how in the past Sri Lanka has allowed Chinese subs to dock at Colombo port, and that in the past has raised concerns in New Delhi. And also this talk about about a balancing relations between Sri Lanka's relations with India and China, pursuing a policy of equidistance between China and India. That harks back to what the Rajapaksa dynasty sought to do. They in fact came up with this phrase, equidistance. But India is located next door to Sri Lanka, while China is located far away from Sri Lanka. So it cannot be an equidistance foreign policy approach to India and China. I think AKD made the right noises in New Delhi. He said the right things. And I think his policies will be watched very, very carefully by Indian policymakers.
Right. Just to try and understand the Sri Lankan perspective, Rohan, how worried should India be with this outreach to China as well? Of course, we understand there are two competing big nations, in fact, at this moment, and Sri Lanka will have to balance the interest of both. How do you see the president, the current president, in fact, whether he's succeeding or not as far as this endeavor is concerned?
The issue can be seen in three parts. One is ordinary commercial merchant vessels. I don't think there's going to be a big dispute about that. The second is military vessels that are called military vessels. And there are certain protocols that have to be followed for doing that. And that problem, I think, is manageable. The really difficult issue is research vessels. And that is the current friction. Now, what the Chinese party officials said, and it was not reciprocated in that particular communique, was that they would like this matter to be resolved. Because what we were living under was a suspension of all visits by research vessels, irrespective of country. Now, my understanding was that that time that we bought with that suspension would be used to develop a systematic approach, a protocol for handling these matters, because Sri Lanka has got an exclusive economic zone of 17 times its landmass. And I think India is also beginning to pay attention to this problem, because the word hydrography was mentioned in the joint communique. I think what we should encourage is joint India-Sri Lanka research activities in the maritime zone. Now, unfortunately, instead of a policy that we were expecting, as of this afternoon, the government has announced that they're going to handle these matters on a case-by-case basis, which is seriously a suboptimal solution, because you don't want to be arguing these things on a case-by-case basis, either from the perspective of Sri Lanka, Sri Lankans, and from the perspective of India. What you want is a protocol, a systematic standard operating procedure that is properly consulted, not necessarily in the eyes of the news media, and then implemented fairly and transparently with due notice. Because I think we can't continue to prohibit all research, but I would even say that, any research vessel that works in this region has to have experts,
Yes.
both from Sri Lanka and India, on it. And if people don't allow that,
Right.
I don't think it should be allowed.
Brahma Chellaney, so let me understand this. What would be India would be watching these developments very, very closely. What would be a red line for India? Something that they want to, in fact, send across a message to the new Sri Lankan administration that red line should not be crossed. Else, of course, there will be strain on the relationship.
What China is seeking to do is to find some foothold in the Indian Ocean region. China has managed to gain dominance in the South China Sea. It's seeking now to march westward to the Indian Ocean. So this attempt to map the floor of the Indian Ocean through these so-called research vessels, which are huge ships, they are part of the military domain of China. They engaged in efforts to map the Indian Ocean seabed, to make it, to gain the kind of knowledge and understanding necessary for Chinese subs to operate by stealth in India's backyard. These are issues of concern to India, because India is the dominant maritime power in the Indian Ocean. It doesn't want China now to expand its hold from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean region. So whether it's Sri Lanka or the Maldives, if any of these countries seeks to do things that are inimical to India's interests, there will be reaction from India. But I think what our fellow panelists said, that if there's any research vessel that seeks to engage in activity in Sri Lanka's backyard or in Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone, if there are Sri Lankan and Indian personnel on board, then obviously that will help to remove any misgivings, because there'll be then some degree of transparency. But you don't expect China to allow Sri Lankans, forget about Indians, even Sri Lankans to be actually part of the research activity. So I think that the Chinese, because of their opaque nature of carrying out maritime activities, they pose a challenge to whichever country with which they seek to collaborate with.
Right. Rohan, how big a challenge is trying to balance both these countries for Sri Lanka? Because There is already the development of the Hambantota port and the presence of the Chinese there. And India, and the president, when he came to India, he said that he would not let Sri Lankan soil be used for anything which challenges the security of India. At this moment, how big a challenge is to try and balance both these countries out for the Sri Lankan administration?
I think from the time of Mrs. Bandaranaike, who was a great friend of India, we have been balancing. I like to tell the story that in 1971, when we had the insurrection led by essentially the current president's party, he wasn't even born back then. India was sent us troops to ensure the security of our airport, our link to the outside world. And China was one of the first countries to give us arms and ammunition to supplement our meager resources. So I think this balancing can be done, but just be done very carefully and cleverly. Now, the previous president, who was a very experienced political leader, he had put this suspension in place. What we were expecting was that the suspension would continue and we would get a sustainable and broadly consulted policy. Instead, we are getting this case-by-case story, which is going to make nobody happy. Case-by-case means they tell us that they're coming in 2 months, and then we say either yes or no. That is, in my opinion, a very unsatisfactory outcome in terms of balancing. So I agree that we have to take our geographical location into account, and we have to ensure, as our president said, that India's security interests are looked after. And I think that's what many sane Sri Lankans of goodwill would want. However, we can't, as an independent country, we can't say that the Chinese can't come here. We have to have our relationships with them as well. But as I said, if we have a policy that includes the presence of Sri Lankan scientists, experts, etc.,
yes,
and maybe even in some cases of Indian oversight or participation, then I think the Chinese will have to decide that they'll have to do research with somebody else. But those are matters that can be put in overall policy rather than on a case-by-case basis.
So possibly till the time some sort of a policy, doctrine does come through, it will be very closely watched with how the government is treading in the next few days as far as both these countries are concerned. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on this discussion.